I'm Athena Karp, GM of HiredScore at Workday. HiredScore is a company I founded and have led as CEO for the last 11 years. It was recently acquired by Workday, and I've been a part of Workday ever since. I started HiredScore from a personal experience. My first job out of college was in investment banking on Wall Street. And our first day on the job, we had a break, and I noticed the long line at the men's room, and there was virtually no line in the women's room. Because that's the opposite of what we typically see in society, I was really surprised to learn that the company I worked for had really inspiring diversity and inclusion goals. And yet, there were many challenges with the manual, human instinct-based processes in terms of being able to achieve our hiring, promotion, and workforce inclusion goals. So I started HiredScore to make hiring, promotions, and workforce planning more fair and efficient. With that as our founding mission, it's been core to our company since inception to create compliant by design AI and deliver innovation safely in HR. Thus today, we are here to learn how do we navigate compliant by design artificial intelligence, especially for HR? How do you build a culture, strategy, and solutions of responsible AI and compliance across AI products? Beyond check the box, what are the possibilities for innovation around compliance and the benefits it brings to all stakeholders? And what is advice for navigating the changing legal environment and early AI laws as innovation leaders in your companies? What I noticed over the last 15 years of being surrounded by data science and AI technologies in regulated industries, from healthcare to HR, is that with most next-gen technologies, you're often forced to choose between innovation and safety. And this is especially true in areas where the regulation is just emerging, since technology always moves faster than laws. In the example of AI for HR, it's rarely about doing the wrong versus right thing, although of course there's often cited bad examples such as using facial recognition AI for candidate screening, but it's more often about working hard to translate what the laws or precedents for humans mean for machines. As an example with HR, we have decades of case law going back to the civil rights movement of how humans need to conduct themselves in hiring, promotions, and other HR-related areas, such as how do you ensure similarly qualified people are treated similarly? And this is what's exciting, because unlike industries such as self-driving cars, where we don't know what regulation will translate from human drivers to machine drivers, here there is clarity. So the hard work essentially becomes, how do we define which laws and practices should be built into the programs? Which tests can and should be run? What other precautions can we put in place, such as selecting training data samples? And what instructions do we give end users on how to use these products? This is why the most successful leaders I've seen do a few things very well. One, they have clarity and confidence in what the human standards that must be followed today and how they translate to technologies. Two, they partner closely with various stakeholders, from legal, employment law, ethical AI teams, privacy, and engineering teams. Three, they leverage their partners for the latest industry developments and to continually ask for updates of what new or proposed legislation means for these products. And four, they partner with vendors to innovate with compliance, not either or. Viewing compliance as an innovation opportunity is one of the biggest differences I've seen across the companies we work with. As an example, a large hospital system had a wonderful compliance leader. She was eager to help her HR leaders bring new technologies, but also wanted to see innovation around challenging to unlock diversity, equity, and inclusion areas. This leader posed it as an incubation challenge. How could we bring recruiters visibility into their ability to build diverse slates while respecting data minimums, which were necessary for personal data privacy and to maintain anonymization efforts? This then became a new feature, which today is available for every client and is a true differentiator, as all other companies make you choose between respecting personal data privacy or visibility into ability to build a diverse slate. But with HiredScore, we've balanced both. Another example is with Fetch. This is our talent rediscovery solution. So everyone that applied to a job and got rejected, the 98+%, can be rediscovered for jobs in the future. And we voluntarily designed an opt-out, which, although not legally required by law, is something we wanted to go above and beyond the requirements and offer clients to configure per their preference. We found in the first 6 months of Go Live, over 90% of candidates opted in or did not opt out, which is actually a good thing. What this means is over 90% want a job at your company, not just the one job that they applied for, but the 10% that did opt out, they only want this one job, which is a really good thing for an HR team to know, and it gives people a sense of control over their data and its use. I often say that this is HR's golden moment, that HR teams have an opportunity to play a pivotal role in leading their organizations in AI governance. As an investor in healthcare in my early career, I learned a lot about how regulation led to better outcomes for the industry overall and gave both vendors and companies guardrails for what technology should do, not what it could do. And I'll give one example. One of the companies I worked with, we had a vision of doctor voice to cash and a bold thesis that we could give doctors back an hour of their day, and we could address a lot of the manual, non-strategic core work that the doctor does outside of patient work through automation and data science. This was around the same time that the industry was moving from ICD-9 to ICD-10, so hospitals still had valuable real estate that was being poorly used with transcriptionists in-house, and many of the transcriptionists would have rather retired than learn ICD-10. And couple that with the fact that so much of this data was already digital and prime for learning. So it was really the perfect storm of key talent doctors doing non-strategic work, workforce shifts and retirement misaligning workforce supply with the work demand. And it was really tempting to say, well, based on these challenges, let's strive to just automate the coding of medical records, right? But that's where regulation knowledge comes into play. Because in healthcare, every error could be tens of millions of dollars in medical malpractice or insurance fraud. So we had to be very intentional about what products to build, which ended up being much more like a spell check on top of the bill that could augment the doctor's efficiency and the workload of the transcriptionist to handle more records. This led to increased capacity, higher quality work, and more satisfied employees and business outcomes, while also automating the transcriptionist in their shift from ICD-9 to ICD-10. In starting HiredScore, I knew HR was also a regulated space. So it was much less about what could the technology do, but much more about what should the technology do? And how do we build embracing these laws and best practices that were already in our space since the civil rights movement and focus on how the machine and the human collaboration could solve really hard problems for key people that greatly benefited from these lifts. I think this is actually HR's golden moment because HR can lead the company in one of the hardest unsolved problems from the CEO, CTO, CIO, and boards, which is how do you leverage AI with governance? And HR has deep expertise in what governance means for HR. So this is really a special opportunity to be the example in the org across AI use cases of how governance is part of every product and how leaders bring these tools to life while being able to represent what responsible governance of them means. HR leaders can take the lead in defining the frameworks, the policies, and infrastructure that govern the AI applications for the HR function. HR expertise means they already have clarity of what regulations the humans now need to harness with the AI to solve these urgent challenges such as unskilled workforces, job displacement, and talent shortages. Leaders can focus their AI for HR governance agenda on truly positioning HR as the business leaders at this critical time in their org's AI explorations and show quantifiable impact from these AI usages. It's rare and exciting in the case of HR to come across challenges that meet the intersection of good for people and good for business. We see this across the board in HR, such as fairness in hiring, fairness in promotions, rediscovery for jobs if you don't get the job the first time that you apply. All of the AI use cases we've built for an HR over the last decade fall within these two parameters, which is good for people and good for the business. And that brings purpose and great impact to the work that we do. But since this is HR, whether you're internally building or purchasing technology, there must be a strong focus from the evaluation process to post-launch on these three core areas: responsible AI and fairness, privacy, individual data protections, and data security. From there, how we structure complying with the laws in the HR space, what I've seen over the last decade plus of building these type of technologies is every law really conforms within these three pillars. They might stretch them to add new definitions, like a new audit in New York City Local Law 144, but essentially it falls into one, notice, which is the notification of the use of AI for all applicants and employees. It can include the description of what the AI does and the service it provides. It includes the criteria that's being used to evaluate candidates or employees, and describing what data is being used. 2, opt-in and opt-out. This is the ability to self-select out of the AI application. It includes equitable treatments of opted-out candidates and employees, and consent to AI processing, both with and without alternatives. 3, bias audits. This includes how training data is handled, requirements of disclosure of audit results, bias testing of live products, both client-specific and general, and safeguarding to prevent the introduction of bias on an ongoing basis, all including controls and tests to continually monitor bias post-launch. And then finally, important but not unique to HR, is how do we decide what we build and what not to build, and why? In HR, as the EEOC clarified, there are not laws for humans and separate laws for machines. The machines will be vetted and evaluated against the same laws that apply to humans. This is great news. What is critically important, though, is that we never view compliance in AI for HR as a check-the-box exercise. It's never done. It's not a feature or capability. It's rather a product line that is constantly evolving. And this evolution could be from a number of factors. First, new standards or laws, for example, international groups such as the World Economic Forum releasing a new framework, or state and local legislation that might create new audits or opt-out clarity or options. Second, learning from adjacent or other industries, and then bringing those best practices into the AI for HR space. We talked about AI in healthcare, but this could also be AI in finance or other key areas that matter greatly to people or that are deemed high risk, which can include new ways to test for bias, different methods for data treatment that removes data imbalances that can produce bias learning, and also new methods for achieving AI explainability. Third, leveraging new technological developments. For example, new types of tests that might only be possible because the new technologies at our disposal. An example of this is beyond our bias tests at HiredScore, we were recently able to produce a new deep layer of testing on the components level. So in this case, we weren't just testing, did we treat similarly qualified people similar, but did we understand people at the deep level? Did we parse them and parse similar qualifications similarly so that we didn't just parse unfairly and then not detect it on the outcome layer? And lastly, defining new metrics for AI and technology that aren't even possible with humans so that we can unlock fairness on levels previously unmeasured, such as tracking the treatment of every person, that it's consistent, which is what the law tells us we're supposed to do. But with humans, testing for consistency, especially across different humans, is impossible. With AI, it's easy to measure that the same treatment is given 100% of the time. It's so exciting to think of how many places where when we compare today's reality of human actions, for example, in hiring and promotions, it goes against our values, our standards, and sometimes even our laws. But AI in HR gives us the ability to start testing decisions, to bring decision support to the humans that take these decisions to better align with the reality we want to see, and also brings us new methods of tracking adherence to laws and practices. such as detecting when are we hiring aligned versus misaligned with basic qualifications, or are we following procedures for hiring employees and internal mobility. The AI is always a better rule follower than the humans, and this is very powerful. That can be used to make clear where do we have a policy that people aren't following, and then we can choose what we want to do about it. In terms of highlighting gaps and the power this can bring decision makers, a great example outside of HR is with self-driving cars. If you've ever been in one on the highway, it's frightening because the self-driving car is following the speed limit when everyone around you is speeding by, because the self-driving car is following the rules, but it hasn't adapted to its current environment, which can become really dangerous if then that puts you at risk of being in a crash. And that, at the end of the day, challenges our decisions and puts the process back on the human to determine what is the right decision in every scenario and what policies and processes should we be following. So that takes us to the end of today's lesson. We are so grateful that you've joined us. I hope you come away inspired to embrace compliance in your AI transformation journeys.